The burning sky, Varig Flight 820's final approach to Orly. Picture yourself minutes from landing, the runways of Paris-Orly Airport visible below. Wednesday, July 11th, 1973, 2:03 p.m. A massive Boeing 707 carrying 134 people was 5 kilometers west of the airport, preparing for what should have been a standard arrival after crossing the Atlantic. Nobody saw this coming. In those final minutes, something went terribly wrong. Smoke filled the cabin, turning a normal approach into a desperate fight for survival. Passengers and crew were suddenly in an unimaginable crisis. The ground was in sight, safety almost within reach, yet the aircraft was rapidly becoming a death trap. I'm Captain James Harlow. After 28 years in the cockpit, I've seen enough to know that an aircraft fire on approach is the most terrifying emergency a crew can face. Welcome aboard. Let me tell you about the people on board that day and what made Varig Flight 820 so vulnerable. This was a Boeing 707-345C, registration PP-VJZ, a true workhorse. Built in 1968, it had logged 21,470 hours across 5,677 flights. 4 Pratt & Whitney JT3D-3B turbofan engines powered it, reliable engines for the long-haul routes this aircraft routinely flew. The flight left Rio de Janeiro Galeão International Airport bound for Paris-Orly. Picture the journey. A long Atlantic crossing, passengers settling in for hours, some sleeping, some reading, enjoying a meal. In 1973, air travel was different. Smoking was permitted on board, a constant, low-level fire risk that modern aviation doesn't tolerate. Cabin interiors were finished with materials that by today's standards would be considered highly flammable and produced toxic fumes when burned. Fire in the air is terrifying. Fire in the cabin on approach, with a plane full of people, is a nightmare compounded by proximity to the ground and the false promise of safety. On the flight deck were 4 experienced crew members. Captain Gilberto Araújo da Silva, a veteran pilot with thousands of hours, was flying. He was known for his calm demeanor, a father of 3. First Officer Alcir Lemos was a rising star at Varig, meticulous and eager to learn from seasoned captains like Araújo da Silva. Flight engineer Jorge Carneiro was the systems expert, focused on the machinery that kept the 707 flying. Navigator Antonio Fujimoto guided them across the Atlantic. These weren't just names on a manifest. They were professionals with families and a commitment to getting 134 people safely to their destination. Among those 134 people were diverse lives. Madame Solange Montaigne, a 62-year-old French art dealer, was returning home from a buying trip in Brazil, eager to see her grandchildren. She carried a small, precious sculpture in her hand luggage. Young Paulo Ricardo, 24, was traveling to Paris to begin graduate studies in engineering, with a scholarship in hand and a future full of promise. Mr. Edward Thompson, a 48-year-old American oil company executive, was heading to a crucial business meeting, likely reviewing notes as the aircraft descended. These were the lives and dreams on board PP-VJZ as it made its final approach. The environment inside a 707 in 1973 was fundamentally different from today. Imagine leaving a stack of old newspapers in a closed, warm room. A small spark, perhaps from a carelessly discarded cigarette, could quickly escalate. This aircraft's cabin wasn't engineered with fire-retardant materials, smoke detection, or advanced fire suppression systems we require today. When fire breaks out in such an environment, it consumes, generating dense, toxic smoke that rapidly incapacitates. This was the silent, unseen enemy that boarded Varig Flight 820 that day. The Atlantic crossing had been uneventful, routine for 1973. Weather around Paris-Orly was clear with good visibility. No mechanical warnings prior to descent. No indication of anything wrong. Captain Araújo da Silva and his crew had guided their aircraft from Rio de Janeiro to European skies, now preparing for the final phase. As the flight descended toward Orly, the cabin crew began routine arrival preparations. Madame Montaigne was likely gathering her belongings, adjusting her watch to local time. Paulo Ricardo might have been looking out the window, anticipating his new life in Paris. Mr. Thompson was closing his briefcase, ready for his meeting. Then, something different began. As the aircraft descended through approximately 9,000 feet, smoke appeared in the rear lavatories. At first it was subtle, a faint odor easily dismissed as a common airplane smell. It quickly intensified. A flight attendant found a small fire in a waste bin in one of the rear lavatories. These waste bins in the 1970s weren't built to modern fire containment standards. The crew immediately tried to extinguish it. They discharged onboard fire extinguishers, standard procedure for a cabin fire. But the fire wasn't easily suppressed. It was already spreading, unseen, behind the lavatory panels, fueled by the cabin's interior materials. This was no ordinary waste bin fire. It was feeding on the very fabric of the aircraft's interior. The flight deck was alerted. Captain Araujo da Silva was informed of the fire, which at this stage seemed manageable. They were on approach, close to an airport. The logical decision was to continue to Orly. As the aircraft descended further, the cabin situation deteriorated rapidly. The smoke, initially confined to the rear, began spreading forward, dense and acrid. Passengers in the rear were the first directly affected. Panic began setting in. People moved forward, seeking breathable air. The cabin crew, well-trained, tried to maintain order, guiding passengers and distributing wet cloths to cover mouths, a desperate measure against the increasing toxicity. While the flight crew knew about a fire, the full extent of the danger wasn't immediately clear. The cockpit, with its separate ventilation, would have been relatively clear initially, masking the horror unfolding feet behind them. Captain Araujo da Silva and First Officer Alcir Lemos focused on maintaining control, executing emergency checklists, and preparing for immediate landing. They requested an emergency landing from air traffic control at Orly, declaring fire on board. Air traffic controllers cleared Varig 820 for a direct approach to runway 26. Airport emergency services were alerted. The smoke became thicker, hotter, and more dangerous. The materials burning weren't just producing smoke. They generated highly toxic gases, primarily carbon monoxide. These gases rapidly incapacitated anyone exposed. Madame Montaigne, Mr. Thompson, and Paulo Ricardo would have struggled to breathe, their vision obscured, their minds disoriented. The chaos would have been unimaginable. The fire consumed the rear cabin, burning through floorboards and into the cargo hold. The heat was intense. As the aircraft descended through 2,000 feet, just minutes from landing, the situation became critical. The flight crew, likely experiencing smoke in the cockpit, made a desperate decision. They attempted an emergency landing in a field short of the runway. This was a clear sign the aircraft could no longer make a conventional approach. Visibility from the cockpit was deteriorating, and systems necessary to fly it were compromised. The investigation initially explored theories about mechanical failure, perhaps an engine issue. But analysis of the wreckage and black box data, particularly the flight data recorder, told a different story. The engines were functioning normally until moments before impact. Flight controls were responsive. The villain was the fire itself and the smoke it produced. The BEA, the French Accident Investigation Agency, meticulously reconstructed events and found that crew incapacitation from smoke and toxic gases was the primary factor leading to the crash, not structural failure or mechanical malfunction. Captain Araujo da Silva and First Officer Lemos were fighting a battle they couldn't win. The cockpit filled with smoke. Their vision was severely impaired. The instruments they relied on became difficult to see. They were flying blind, not from external weather, but from the internal inferno. At approximately 2:03 p.m., with the aircraft 5 kilometers west of Paris-Orly, the 707 was still in the air. Landing gear down, flaps extended, attempting to slow the aircraft for an emergency touchdown. But the smoke had taken its toll. The crew, disoriented and overcome by toxic fumes, lost control in those final seconds. The aircraft descended rapidly, hitting trees before impacting terrain in a field near the village of Sault-les-Chartreux. The impact was devastating. The aircraft broke apart on contact with the ground, erupting in a post-crash fire. Of the 134 people on board, 123 perished. Among them, Madame Montaigne, Paulo Ricardo, and Mr. Thompson. The 4 flight crew members, Captain Araujo da Silva, First Officer Lemos, Flight Engineer Carnero, and Navigator Fujimoto, all died at their posts. 11 people, Primarily those seated closer to the front who managed to escape the immediate inferno miraculously survived, though many suffered severe injuries. 5 kilometers west of Paris-Orly, the Boeing 707, registration PP-VJZ, is no longer responding to its crew as it should. The ground rushes up. Inside the cockpit, Captain Arajo da Silva and First Officer Lemos fight for every breath, every inch of control. Smoke, thick and acrid, fills their space, burning their eyes, searing their lungs. Carbon monoxide, the silent killer, has already begun its work, clouding their judgment, slowing their reactions. They grip the control yokes, their knuckles white, trying to feel the aircraft, trying to coax it into a survivable landing. Their senses are failing. The instrument panel is a blur of indistinct lights and needles. Their vision, already compromised, succumbs to the overwhelming darkness of the smoke. They're flying by instinct, by a lifetime of training, but that training is suffocated by the inferno behind them. In the cabin, a guttural roar fills the air. The sound of tearing metal begins, a terrifying symphony of destruction. Passengers are thrown forward against their seatbelts as the aircraft hits the first line of trees. Madame Montaigne, still clutching her sculpture, lets out a choked cry as the cabin lights flicker and die. Paolo Ricardo braces himself, his hands over his head, his dreams of a new life in Paris dissolving in smoke and fear. Mr. Thompson, moments ago reviewing notes, is consumed by the raw, primal instinct to survive, his world turning upside down. The forces are immense, crushing. The airframe shudders violently, twisting, groaning under the strain. There is a deafening shriek as the wings begin to rip away, shedding fragments of metal and fuel. Debris flies through the cabin, projectiles in a confined space. The world outside the windows becomes a terrifying blur of green, brown, and then orange. The sensation is one of profound, inescapable impact. In those final seconds, there was no effective recovery. The crew's desperate decision to aim for an open field was already undermined by the fire's work. The toxic fumes had rendered them largely incapacitated, unable to execute the precise maneuvers required for an emergency landing outside an airport. Physics took over, brutal and unforgiving. The aircraft, already compromised by heat and smoke, was beyond human intervention. The fight against fire had consumed their ability to fly. The echoes of impact reverberate across the quiet French countryside. From the village of Saulay-Chartreux, residents witness the horror first, seeing the plume of black smoke rising against the summer sky. They rush toward the crash site. Within minutes, pre-alerted emergency services from Paris-Orly arrive, flashing lights and wailing sirens. Firefighters immediately confront an intense post-crash blaze, a formidable inferno that devours what remains of the 707. Medical teams begin the grim search for any signs of life. The scene is unimaginable destruction, scattered wreckage, and the acrid smell of burning fuel and cabin materials. Out of 134 souls on board, only 11 are found alive, pulled from the smoldering wreckage, severely injured but miraculously surviving. For those 11, a new battle for life begins. Meanwhile, the first investigators from the BEA secure the site. Their meticulous work starts immediately, laying the groundwork for understanding this tragedy. In Paris, families waiting for Varig Flight 820 learn the devastating news, plunging them into profound grief. When we look back at Varig Flight 820, the BEA's meticulous work clearly illuminated the critical factors. These weren't isolated issues, but a confluence of elements that created an impossible situation for an experienced crew. This wasn't pilot error or primary mechanical failure. It was a battle against an invisible, relentless enemy that the aircraft and aviation standards of the time simply weren't equipped to fight. First, the fundamental vulnerability of aircraft construction in that era. The 707-345C, like many aircraft built in the 1960s and early 1970s, relied heavily on highly combustible materials. Cabin linings, seat fabrics, insulation, and waste bins weren't designed to contain or resist fire for extended periods. When a small fire, likely ignited by a discarded cigarette in a lavatory waste bin, began to burn, it found ample fuel. The fire didn't just burn the bin's contents, it rapidly spread behind panels, consuming the aircraft's interior structure. The fire wasn't immediately visible or accessible, creating an insidious problem that grew unchecked in the confined cabin space. Second, and perhaps more insidious, was the nature of the smoke itself. While flames were deadly, the real killer on Varig 820 was the dense, toxic smoke produced by burning cabin materials. These materials released highly poisonous gases, primarily carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is a silent killer. It's odorless, colorless, and rapidly incapacitates. Passengers and crew exposed to these fumes quickly became disoriented, confused, and eventually unconscious. The BEA found that rapid incapacitation from smoke inhalation was the primary cause of the high fatality count. Even as the aircraft was moments from landing, people inside were succumbing to the toxic atmosphere, making any coordinated escape or effective control of the aircraft almost impossible. Third, the onboard firefighting capabilities weren't designed to handle a fire of this magnitude and type. While cabin crew immediately tried to extinguish the fire with handheld extinguishers, these tools work for small, contained fires. The fire on Varig 820 had quickly spread beyond the waste bin, becoming a concealed fire within the aircraft's structure. Handheld extinguishers can't reach a fire hidden behind panels or address widespread smoke and toxic gas production. Aviation safety protocols and equipment are always evolving, often in response to tragedies like this. In 1973, the industry hadn't fully grasped the critical need for advanced smoke detection in lavatories, fire-retardant cabin materials, or robust fire suppression systems. This incident exposed a profound gap in the defensive layers of aviation safety, leaving the crew with insufficient means to fight an unmanageable blaze. The BEA definitively concluded that rapid fire spread and subsequent crew and passenger incapacitation from highly toxic carbon monoxide were the direct causes. What was discovered was a stark truth. The aircraft's cabin materials, standard for the era, became a deadly accelerant, transforming a small fire into an uncontrollable inferno that quickly rendered human intervention futile. In-flight fires, especially those hidden behind panels, presented a threat the aviation industry simply wasn't prepared to counter. This understanding led to profound, lasting changes. The lessons from Varig Flight 820, combined with other similar tragedies, became a crucial catalyst for the 1985 amendment to Federal Aviation Regulation 25.853, issued by the FAA. This landmark regulation mandated significantly more fire-resistant materials for all aircraft cabin interiors, including seat cushions, wall panels, and ceiling panels. The accident also spurred widespread requirement for lavatory smoke detectors, a simple yet critical safety feature providing early warning against similar ignitions. These changes weren't just bureaucratic adjustments. They were direct responses to the horrifying reality faced by those on PP-VJZ. Since their implementation, enhanced fire safety standards have undoubtedly saved tens of thousands of lives across the globe. The 123 souls lost on that Wednesday in July 1973 ultimately paved the way for a safer sky for everyone who flies today. This accident forces us to consider the limits of human endurance and the speed at which disaster unfolds. Captain Araujo da Silva and his crew faced an impossible situation, battling both the fire and its toxic byproducts while trying to fly a compromised aircraft. If you were in that cockpit, receiving initial reports of smoke moments from Orly, but unable to see the true scale of the inferno behind you, would you have made the same call to continue toward the airport? Or would you have attempted an immediate emergency landing in open terrain even earlier? These stories are more than accidents. They're crucial lessons etched into aviation history. Lessons that keep all of us safer today. My goal is to share these insights with a community that truly appreciates the complexities and heroism inherent in flying.